Imperva is the comprehensive digital security leader on a mission to help organizations protect their data and all paths to it. Only Imperva protects all digital experiences, from business logic to APIs, microservices, the data layer, and from vulnerable legacy environments to cloud-first organizations. With an integrated approach combining network, application, and data security, Imperva protects companies ranging from cloud-native startups to global multinationals with hybrid infrastructure. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva. Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the zero-noise application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other Appsec solution. Invicti, Appsec with zero noise. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Nick Selby about cloud misconfigurations that even mature companies make. And speaking of maturity, how to talk about AI security without invoking Skynet all the time. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Akira Brand, and it's just about time for the news. But first, one announcement. Security Weekly listeners save $100 on their RSA Conference 2023 full conference pass. RSA Conference will take place April 24th through 27th in San Francisco and virtually, aka on demand. To register with our discount code, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC2023 and use the code 53UCyber. We hope to see you there. And now, John and Akira, as we've been doing lately, we're starting off with a question. And this question comes from a listener, Paul, who says, what do you think of CORS? And I believe by CORS, he's talking about the cross-origin resource sharing header. And we have, for those of you who are audio only, John's head has just exploded, not cool scanners style-wise, but just an absolute headache-wise. So we've got his answer right there, I think. Would you care to expand on that, John, while Akira thinks of her response?
I had happily forgotten about this question until you had to go and bring it up again. Yeah, this is sort of a trigger word for me.
Okay. I see that.
Let's see if I can summarize this quickly. So this came from this particular listener actually sent a story along with. I don't know if you have a link for that in there or not, Mike.
No, I'll have to add that.
But there was a link. So first, CORS. CORS is as a security concept. Great idea. You know, let's stop cross-site request forgeries and some other things like that. Let's allow the source web application to have control over what the browser's actually going to be loading for that web page. Sounds like a great idea. But for developers, man, I tell you, and like this is the rant I went on before, and you guys, esteemed listeners, are getting a very short version of this. As a developer, server-side developer, it's something that we get that thing written as quickly as possible, and like it looks like it works, and we move on to what we want to do. It's a pain in the butt to troubleshoot. It's sometimes browser specific. Little white space changes or capitalizations can make things break. So this was provided along with a link to a new Go package, which is middleware to apparently in theory make CORS easier. And I'm like, I've already got it working in once, and like, you know, I've used it in Gorilla, which I now know is sunsetted in Gin in the past. And like, why would I go and learn that again? So it's the idea of what it provides is great, but I'm guessing I'm not the only person out there that it has a very violent reaction when they hear about it.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was first learning how to program, I remember coming up against CORS errors and just being like so dumbfounded for so long. Like, holy crap, it's such a stymieing thing, right? And even now, like when I come up against CORS errors, just like my heart sort of sinks. Like, oh man, like now I gotta fix all this stuff. And yeah, I understand why it exists, but I feel like maybe this is maybe a really big stretch. Let's find out. But it could sort of be in the same vein of like having people have to do MFA in order to protect their accounts, but the MFA itself becomes so freaking cumbersome that people just don't use it, or they complain about it all the time. And it's not like a great way to actually address the problem. I think CORS might be in that same vein. I'm curious what you guys think.
Well, Ty, that I'm not sure I agree that it's in the same vein in terms of the solution. I think MFA has excellent solutions, but it introduces additional problems that are still desirable to have. Well, desirable to continue to solve, I should say, in terms of protecting accounts, being resistant to phishing, and so on, resistant to replay. So we'll talk about FIDO and WebAuthn shortly. Got some articles for that. But to come back to cores, I think I do agree with both of you that I've come around to being less enamored of security headers, browser client-side security headers, of just saying, here's how I want to share the response from a server across domains, as well as like content security policy. I think we're up to CSP level 3 by now. But it's sort of like, does anybody really care? Why should we bother? Maybe if we just, now this is going to sound glib, maybe if we just wrote the applications more secure in the first place, we wouldn't have to deal with the browser. But honestly, I say that on purpose because I'd rather focus the security boundaries and security architecture and the code itself, the server-side code, the web application code, rather than trying to bring those into the web browser itself, because I think I didn't appreciate the pain that developers go through when you start to make those types of recommendations.
And I have to go back and really briefly finish the rant because I remembered I hadn't even talked about serverless yet. And when you put an API gate, like at least an Amazon API gateway in front of this, you have to go back through and redo all your core stuff again. So it's the thing which keeps giving. And I think if I want to bring it back to MFA example, MFA is at least is like it's enter these 6 digits that sort of almost repeat themselves. Okay, cool. I can do that unless there's a site I've been grumbling about on Twitter, which is making me enter them every time. But at least in my mind, and it could be partially as a security guy, MFA doesn't bother me on a site that I think deserves security or authentication validation. But if it's like MFA on, I don't know, some cat subreddit on Reddit, then I'd be like, okay, why do I need to enter my MFA for this? So I think there's a bit of a trade-off on that one. And maybe that's the same thing. It's just how I think of these different things of like, why do I have to deal with this? I'm with you, Mike. I get the idea that I can imagine the mindset of people creating cores of like, hey, we've got these applications. We're never going to get them all secure. How can we help provide security by approaching this from a browser point of view? So I get that. But now I want to go back and solve it the other way.
Yeah, and I've got some articles too that I think will continue this conversation on about just the developer perspective. But first, since we've been talking about MFA, Reddit, they reported a breach, relatively transparently. This was a good thing. I highlighted it because on the tail of just having a great conversation with Adrian about security myths, they repeated the trope: humans are the weakest link. And they've included the XKCD comic, which is funny, and kind of tries to illustrate the point. But I was pointing out too that if we're jumping straight to blaming humans, and especially if we're just saying humans in general, or we're not qualifying a type of human, or the human who has these tools available to them, or has these processes to support them, I don't think we're doing a very good threat model, and I think we're being a little bit defeatist. So my response here is, of course, the XKCD comment has has the joke about having a $5 wrench to recover somebody's secret passphrase to their secret key, rather than having the $1 million password breaking setup. But you could also just have a $50 YubiKey to counter a lot of these phishing attacks as well. And that is also, I think, that the direction of to go with MFA, keeping in mind that we still need to address account recovery, especially for in the consumer space. So that was the angle I wanted to take this Reddit breach in. And Akira, I know you were also looking at this, maybe had some questions, or were maybe not quite agreeing with what I was saying, or maybe I wasn't expressing myself very well.
No. I actually just put another article in that has a similar point to the initial one, that humans are indeed the weakest link, to borrow from the excellent 2000s show. I'm definitely not taking a side here. I think that you're correct, Mike, that if we're able to get spearfish, and then all of a sudden, of course, all of the data is compromised, and that's clearly more of an issue on threat modeling or the internal security controls. But that's definitely not to say that we shouldn't continue to educate our employees, have regular phishing sort of spoofs for people, So I don't know. I think it's a little bit of both. It's a little column A and it's a little bit column B.
So, where I'm coming from is very much in the spirit of, like I said, in this case, the person who was phished reported it. So it's a good thing too that you have a security culture that is not blame oriented, and that's really what I'm reacting to strongly here, because you want to encourage people to say, "Whoops, I accidentally clicked on this link or responded to this email, and sorry, I forgot to pull out my IDN UTF-8 visual transpiler recorder for my brain to figure out, is this an L or a romanized I or a Cyrillic," whatever, silly things that security awareness training tries to point to, rather than just say, here's a strong MFA, rather than just a TOTP. Maybe it's also a code matching. We've seen Duo, Okta push out different ways of handling TOTP challenges that are a bit more resistant to phishing, as well as I mentioned FIDO keys. So I think where I'm just coming down is let's not put blame on users. Let's actually give users better tools so this process can work better. And maybe let's move on to a bunch of other articles, because we have a ton. Speaking of blame, I did try to resist blame on the a write-up about hacking into Toyota's global supplier management network, which really just stood out as some really dead simple vulns that always surprise me when somebody finds these about apparently a client-side access control that was implemented in Angular. And they just did some JavaScript fiddling with Fiddler, so the Windows-based version of Burp, essentially, or equivalent. And another one was just they found an API that would create a jot to do user impersonation, and basically then had complete control of the system. So it's some of those things that pretty dead simple, and it ties back to the idea of having a bug bounty. The researcher didn't get there was no bug bounty program, so they didn't get any money for this. And they said they weren't incentivized to keep poking around. And I think in this case, Toyota doesn't need to launch a bug bounty. They need to launch some basic scanning, fuzzing, security coding practices and architecture review before turning on a bug bounty program and spending money on things that could be found with tools. But I think that's the best I can squeeze out of that one. Not sure if either of you can have anything interesting for that.
The thought in my head this morning when I was reading this was more focused around just reminding our listeners to be careful when you do something like this without a company's permission. But at the same time, I'm like, you can hear I'm sort of wavering on that point now as I say it. I think there's, it's because I'm thinking of another situation where if there's an application that you own or you've bought, and you start playing with that, you're on sort of edgy ground here. We've seen enough cases where companies decide that they're going to sue someone over stuff like this. And there's great ways to learn, and I think there's great things in here to say, this is what you should not be doing, but just be thoughtful, I guess, when you do this type of thing. That was my biggest takeaway. I mean, there's nothing. There's nothing of significance beside the fact that, as what Mike said, that they need to do a little bit better job. But I don't know. Does that make sense to you guys? Would you agree with that, or am I being too sensitive?
No, I think you're right. Like, I know that in some places that if you point a DAS tool or a fuzzer or whatever at a website that you don't have written permission to, that's technically illegal, and they can take legal action against you. And on the other hand, like, maybe it's more of a takeaway of, look, if I don't put a fuzzer or a DAST, if I don't scan my app with a DAST, then someone else will, and they can find all these little hanging fruits. So it's just a reminder to use the tools that you have.
And I mean, we cover articles like this a lot, so it's not like this is the one. I'm not trying to point these guys out. It's just a thought that popped in my head when I was reading this. It felt very. He said himself, like, he was bored, so he decided to go poke around some large corporate networks. That's I don't know.
As one does.
Yes.
There's always the ins and outs of CFAA, and what you start to violate the law, or just what becomes perhaps less ethical, is a callback from our discussion with AI in that areas. Those are areas that would also be great to bring in lawyers to talk about, because there can be one of the things you just want to avoid, even if it is perfectly legal to start scanning, if you start to, you don't want to have to respond to a lawyer if you're not a lawyer yourself. And that could be your time and your expense. And especially if you start to go beyond what you've been authorized to do, whether bug bounty or within just, you woke up this morning and wanted to poke the bear, and the bear just happens to be a big org. But speaking of poking lots of things, John, you had mentioned, for example, you alluded to an article about the crazy amounts of APIs the cloud providers have. Now, I don't know that we have any specific Vulns in them yet, but this is from Wiz, who are known for finding flaws. So tell us more, just how crazy are these APIs out there?
Yeah, so this is from, it's a short but pretty good read. Wiz's 2023 State of the Cloud. Sorry, guys, it's a registration to get the download. But it's a, it's pretty short, and it got some interesting stuff in it. But yeah, so two things hit me. And I think I might have heard about this from, it was in someone else's newsletter last week. So I can't remember if it was in Clint's, I think it was. But anyways, first is a graph and stats around AWS. They're adding approximately 40 new services and 1,600 API actions per year for the last 6 years. So the total number of API actions they have is now around somewhere between 12,000 and 13,000. So the reason, well, let me bring the second spot in, and I'll talk about why I got these. And they got these stats from Bodo Core, and there's another. They're gathering the stats from GitHub projects IAM dataset. The second set of stats was for those APIs. All the public cloud providers have some amount of privileges, right, that you're able to grant or revoke to access those APIs for different roles and different users. So as those APIs, you can imagine, as the number of APIs increases, so does the permissions around them. As of December, Amazon is up around, God, my eyes feel like they're deceiving me, 16,000 permissions. Azure, Azure was at 16,000. Amazon is around 13,000, and then Google is down around 7,000 potential API permissions. And the reason I brought these two things up is, and this feels like it's a advertisement for a tool, but I don't think Wiz makes that tool. I know this tool exists out there, but how do you control those? How do you keep track of those permissions yourself? How do you know? There's the world of Amazon's IAM hell, and I know the other guys have it too. But how do you actually figure out the right permissions that aren't over permissive, as well as just what have you granted out there to all your users? I mean, we were talking last segment about what does the cloud provider, let's pick on Google for a change. What does Google consider secure versus me as an application owner? And that's talking about cloud and application. We haven't even talked about permissions, right? Which is sort of cloud, but it's a pretty deep thing. So I just thought that it's worth people's thinking about it for probably about as long as I've been talking on it now. But yeah, that was my point of bringing it in there.
Yeah, you're going to be, what I'm trying to think of some good words here, just covered, smothered, destroyed underneath that pile of permissions, that complexity, try to keep it straight. And it's one of those things that points out to, it's really hard to have default secure configurations when there's so many microservices you have to interact with. And even if you're just, you're talking about, go back to cores, API gateway, and a couple serverless, a couple Lambda functions, that might seem at start to be pretty reasonable, but then they start to need different access to different data stores. Some are should be read-only, some maybe just need write. You need to get your logging in there, but you definitely then don't want to turn your logging access systems or your incident response systems to be the weakest link, because they're over-permissioned and under-protected. So it's scary. And good luck. Good luck while you fix that. We're going to move on to the next article because I have nothing better I could add to there than my heartfelt sympathy. So perhaps not so much cloud related. We're going to come back to some developer perspective in a second. But real quick, I'd mentioned a while ago, Portswigger and crew had put together voting for their 10 favorite web hacking techniques of 2022. And I think this ties into an article you also had, Akira, about an open letter to OWASP board. And the reason I'm bringing these two together is just Portswigger has done great community building, great awareness of not a top 10 in terms of generic. This is injection attacks. This is misconfigurations, logging and monitoring, but desync, the dirty dancing and sign in OAuth flows, which we covered because I had to get the Patrick Swayze reference in there. And there's also client-side path traversal. That's one of these techniques. And these are all really great, very specific learning techniques to read through. So I encourage our listeners to look at it from that perspective, from education. But I think there's also that type of very direct contribution to education, to moving the techniques forward, or at least highlighting techniques that perhaps OWASP could benefit from. And Akira, tell us a bit more about this article that you found.
Yeah, so I found an open letter to the OWASP board called OWASP Needs to Evolve. It was signed by several people that have, well, more than several, quite a few people that are key contributors onto OWASP tools and are just really key members of the OWASP community. Long story short, what the letter essentially puts forth is that there is a gap, and the gap is what the projects and the community around them want and the support that OWASP provides. So it's sort of saying, like, hey, the world of creating software has evolved quite a lot since OWASP started about 20 years ago. So is the internet, but it seems that OWASP is sort of stuck in this place where it's not evolving with the times. So when you see things like these top 10 web hacking techniques of 2022 coming from communities like Portswigger, that's essentially what these people are saying in this letter is like, hey, if we don't evolve, people are going to go to other resources, and quite frankly, we're going to go to other resources. So in this letter, there's 5 key points that they put forth. I won't list all of them right now, but definitely take a look at that to see kind of what the main takeaways are that these people want OWASP to like actually concretely shift.
Yeah, and John and I talked about a letter from Mark Curphey that was similar to this when he was running for the board. And some of the things that stand out to me is look at what the OpenSSF has done lately with very specific, deliberate investment in supporting the ecosystem of open source security. Say, we're going to find out what are some critical areas, we're going to apply some fuzzing, apply some threat modeling. Now, they were doing this very much from a developer perspective about how to improve the security of this. I think what this is pointing out is OWASP has some tools, but it also has a massive amount of tools and projects that some may not be more relevant now. So maybe we as speaking of OWASP should reorient and reinvest. What are their flagship projects? Invest, curate them to keep them relevant, keep them applicable for security testing so that they are easily adoptable, more easily used by developers. And I think that's a lot of what this is speaking to. So, and creating explicit support both in funding, always important, as well as focus from OWASP.
I think there's it's sort of interesting from a standing up the shoulders of giants point of view, right? We've got some of these older foundations that have done amazing things, which have the original people who founded them and have been lifting and driving them for the last decades are either starting to move on or they're not changing in their mannerisms and their ways of thinking. And then you've got the Linux Foundation, which seems to be doing, at least right now for the last, 3-5 years, a extremely good job at this. And I think that's partially pointing out how good some of the other orgs could be, like you just mentioned with OpenSSF, which is Linux versus OWASP. Mm-hmm. And the reason I'm mentioning is I'm seeing in some other communities too, and I'm not trying not to point fingers and names here, but it shows that like building a community is one of the toughest things you can do. It's ongoing, never ending. What's the word I'm looking for? To really sort of nurture that community and keep it growing and keep it expanding, and how it both relates to the world around it, as well as the effect that it has on that world. So, as we said, I think when we looked at Mark's letter before, I hope they're able to change and improve. That those number figures seemed awfully high to me, 5 to 8 million, but I can't say I've run the number, so I don't know. But I hope that they respond. It's not like they did because he got on the board, didn't he? So hopefully they're going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Yeah, and we'll continue to follow that. And also, what's always great is to have criticism and followed by recommendations, suggestions. And that's one of the things that this letter does model. They're not just saying things are horrible. Here's some very concrete suggestions that we think would be beneficial that we're looking for. So that's always a great thing to see in this type of letter. And I want to bring that into a group of articles that are shifting the perspective to developers. Now, I'm going to lead into this with actually an article from NIST. They had just announced the finalists for their cryptographic algorithms in tiny IoT devices, basically, low profile for computing, memory, CPU, etc. And there's 10 or so of these algorithms, and pretty much all of them have, they have to have a reference implementation of software. All of them are in C. One of them actually had a reference in Rust and in Java and Python. But pretty much, if we're trying to get away from a world where everything is in C, it would also be great to have reference implementations that aren't in C. I will acknowledge up front, begrudgingly perhaps, that IoT environments are lower, they have more restrictions that I don't think you really want to run Python on a Raspberry Pi efficiently if you're in terms of CPU usage, but who knows?
So that was actually the point which caught my interest in this is, so there's both a Raspberry Pi nowadays is a pretty powerful thing. People are using it for their desktops. But if you think about a real IoT device like an 8266 or ESP32 or maybe a lower power one still, most of these things still have ARM cores in them. So you can get CircuitPython, which can run on the smallest of things. So I'm not positive. I want to go read more. I'm not positive what chipsets they're focusing on with this. But my first question is, do we need new low power algorithms? Because that means probably going to be easier to crack. Maybe you're not going to have as much sensitive information on those low end things. But that was the first head scratcher for me. I really like your point though about the Rust part. I think that seems like a no-brainer in 2023 to me. At least go.
And it felt, yeah, and it felt the Rust part too was I had another article about OpenSSL vulnerability, and again, I don't think it was too interesting other than it gave me a chance to mention a Rust TLS alternative that you can't drop in though. So this is just a different group working on a Rust TLS for their ecosystem, but we're possibly going to start seeing just this bifurcation of legacy existing systems sticking with OpenSSL. OpenSSL 3.0 is addressing some architecture problems, some cruft, but it still has some history to it. A lot of people have moved off it, as well as a lot of people have moved off, or I should say a lot of people. One particular example here was a group that was moving off of about 1 million lines of code to another 1 million lines of code. And this is from the real world engineering challenges, from the practical programmer. And it was a discussion from conversation with the pragmatic engineer about I just lost my train of thought there. The large
breaking
was the group Khan Academy.
Yeah.
Yes, getting rid of the monolith of Python, about 1 million lines of Python, split them into about 40 microservices, mostly in Go. And it ended up being pretty much the same amount of lines of code, and it took about 3.5 years. But this was really interesting because it doesn't have I think to me at least, hopefully other people think so, it doesn't have a very specific application security angle to it other than Python 2 was going to be end of life and they're trying to figure out what to do next. But it's a very, I thought, insightful review of how do you just go from one code base to another? How do you go from the 1 million lines of code you need to figure out how to do cores in testing, staging, and environment so cores actually works, into a different set of cores? And Akira, I know you've been diving into some, you're a programmer. I'm not sure how much of this felt familiar to you or scary to you, or just if you've reached your own 1 million lines of code yet in your career.
I wish. That'd be so cool. Yeah, honestly, this felt a little scary to me because I remember learning about OpenSSL with like the Heartbleed bug. And it's still a little bit of a mystery to me how all this stuff works. So to be totally honest, this one, I got a little bit lost in this one.
No worry. And I think that's a good thing to point out, because some of the things of getting lost is I wanted to bring in this conversation about this pragmatic engineer. And John, you had one about an article about two cultures of programming, in the idea of where do security folks get lost or lose the thread in when talking about how software is really developed, and so that Appsec can actually make better recommendations rather than just say you should use cores because it's on this list, or you should use Rust just because it's memory safe. Maybe we should actually have a better appreciation of why, or explaining why and how we're making those recommendations.
Yeah, and that's why I refer to our little bubble, that we're sort of pulling a carrot into our bubble here, but like this is our little tiny world of AppSec where like we think about things in a very specific way. I mean, the audacity for me to say that NIST should be in 2023 providing examples in Rust, that's a pretty egotistical statement. Let's be honest, I'm aware of it. And yeah, I think Akira's response is I mean, it's a response I've seen from God knows how many customers when, both of us were over in that space, is you give them a scan report, they're like, what do I do with this? Obviously upgrade. But it's like, okay, well, can I upgrade, or what do I upgrade to? And what do you do with this? And, I'll be a little cognizant of OPSEC, so I'm not going to say which one, but I'm running a new router here. And in one of their recent firmware updates, they moved from one of the competitors of OpenSSL back to OpenSSL. And I believe that one is, I can't remember which one, it's one of the ones out there. It's LibreSSL, I think, but it's even between which one of these do you use, and then what version do you use? How do you keep it up to date? There's a vulnerability. Is anyone actually going to break into that vulnerability, or is this just like the nerds talking again? It's super complex stuff, man. I'm yeah. How about cores?
And honestly, how about them cores? From my hot take too, like I think that a lot of how do I say this? A lot of people that are learning how to program now are kind of like this type 2 programmer where it's like, it's higher level. There's a lot more open source. It's a lot more dependencies. It's Python, it's Ruby, it's JavaScript. It's not like these very lower level languages like C. And so to try to explain AppSec, like you said, John, like sometimes it's just like quote unquote the nerds talking. And we also have this newer generation of AppSec people like myself that are relatively new to the industry in general. And like, we want to learn from the AppSec gods. It's one of the reasons that I'm here, so I can learn from the two of you and all of these guests. But it can seem like, whoa, this has no actual bearing on the code I just wrote in Python that like displayed, like it called the database and showed a thing on a screen and whatever it is, right? Like relative, like very simple CRUD applications, right? Like how are you going to start to explain AppSec to people where like this might be their only experience is these higher level languages? And that I don't know. I have no idea.
So real quick, what Akira was talking about and what Mike tried to segue over to me was the second article there that we were talking about, two cultures of programming, why both are important. And this is, again, not AppSec related directly, but it talks through, there's these two cultures, and one is sort of, they've got a graphic at the top, like a cartoon. And culture one is like, they're going to put a little more time into making the code faster or better, or like they're sort of thinking about a bigger picture, but not from an architecture point of view, but like they're a little more purist. Let's say it that way. And then culture two is we want to print something on the screen in Python without having like initiate Java classes and do all this other stuff and all this sort of quote unquote junk around it. And then the article goes through, talks about like compares those two cultures. One values big projects, the other values short, meaningful code snippets. My favorite one down here was one values code speed, the other values coding speed, which comes back to what Akira was sort of talking about there. And that's sort of, the neck of where we are. And I think the big struggle we have in AppSec at the end of the day is, it'd be interesting to see. I'm betting, my guess is we don't have as much struggle securing and talking about application security with that type 1 group, with the option 1, as we do with the second folks are like, dude, I just want to print. But yeah, so that was I want to give a little bit of back explanation to people who are wondering exactly what we started talking about.
Mhm. What I'll also say to that is that from my experience, this is just my lived experience. I don't have like data to back this up, but a lot of my colleagues are coming from coding boot camps, and coding boot camps don't necessarily teach you culture one. They usually teach you culture two. Whereas college courses will teach you more culture one, but less and less people are going to college in general, but also for computer science. So we're going to have to figure out how to get culture two involved in Appsec sooner or later, because that may be what's mainly on the market. So something to think about there too.
Well, I think it comes back to the default, secure by default. If something is, I
Mm-hmm.
think secure by default is more necessary to succeed with culture too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that especially in modern world, to bring in the tooling and the support for what helps you either be secure by default or point out your problems, is that especially in the world of C and C++ compilers, I think if you're trying to outsmart the compiler, you're probably not going to. Modern compilers, there can be fun code patterns that maybe it used to work about how to zero a value most efficiently. But if you're worrying about zeroing values most efficiently rather than just everything should be zero initialized, because that helps prevent certain types of integer overflows, certain types of memory overflows, buffer overflows, maybe we should just be relying on the tools and not thinking that we're so smart about this one weird trick to make something zero. And that's why I like the culture too. And maybe thinking aloud here, trying to tie this back to also like where directionally would OWASP should be going? Where are the tools to either point to, rather than yet another hardening guide or a top 10 list, here is the default secure version, or here are the recommended libraries to pull things together so that you can print securely, log securely, work with cores securely, etc. So that's what comes to mind when I was looking at that too, as the two of you were talking.
Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting. And there was another one down there. Even just reading the pull quotes in this article sort of give you the sense of what's going on around testing. Culture one, it can be rigorously mathematically proven that the code doesn't contain errors of a certain type. Versus culture two is there's statistical evidence that the code almost always behaves as expected. And that comes back again, like, think about how many times we do like static analysis on code and like we're like, this line you didn't initialize your, as you just said, and it's like, yeah, it's not talking about Appsec. It sort of is in many ways. But I think my goal in life is how do I both get to that culture too, and how do I help secure them?
So as we think in culture too, there's a couple other articles. We'll just try to end off here with a few random bugs that maybe come out of culture one or culture two. Or speaking of culture, maybe there's a culture three around Twitter. And you can't delete your Twitter DMs, however, though. Kira, this looks like something that should probably be mentioned.
Yeah, I had a friend of mine hit me up once, and she goes, "Hey, can you hack Twitter?" I go, "No, I cannot hack Twitter. Why? Why do you want me to hack Twitter?" She goes, "Well, I said some things in a DM that I really regret saying, and I wish I could get rid of it." And that had me that story came to mind when I saw this article cross my desk, which is if you want to delete your Twitter DMs, well, good luck. The reason this is a problem, well, first off, let me say it this way. People are trying to delete their Twitter DMs, but it's not necessarily getting deleted off of Twitter servers. So this is a problem, first off, because your data isn't being handled in a way that is judicious. Second off, it's an issue because the DMs you send to friends are not end-to-end encrypted. So if Twitter suffers a data breach, your conversations could potentially be accessible. Or if there was staffers that had the right permissions to access them, they'd be able to be read. There had been some requests for comments from Twitter's communications department. But according to this article, the communications department doesn't exist anymore. So that is a little messy. Right now, people are also thinking that according to the GDPR data laws in Europe, that might be a way to force Twitter's hand to absolutely for sure get rid of DMs on their servers, but it's still kind of up in the air. It's remaining to be seen. So long story short, don't say anything on the internet that you'd regret, even if it's in a private DM, because private DMs are not necessarily private. People can still see them if they have the correct permissions or if there is a data breach.
Yeah, that I think to me speaks to the idea of threat modeling or helping your friends threat modeling privacy issues. You mentioned whether or not even the communications are end-to-end encrypted, as well as end-to-end encryption is not necessarily a magic incantation against other types of threats too, especially if you can't trust the other end of the party or the device that they are encrypted upon. And then, of course, I think the only thing that I'll add there is I don't know that Twitter is necessarily motivated by regulatory action, so I'm not sure. I would put too much confidence in GDPR action, but we'll see. John, not sure if you have any more ideas on there. If you want to maybe take us out on just article you had on named pipes in Docker, just to sort of bring us around to other vulnerabilities that catching your eye.
Yes. Sorry, I was going back through my DMs on Twitter and going, is there anything here that I want to not have released? I think I'm in the clear. I don't mind. People can go ahead. Yeah, so let's see. There was a few more, as folks know, we usually have a few more articles than we're able to cover through here in the time. But CyberArk has a really interesting blog post, at least to me, on breaking Docker named pipes systematically. So Docker, most of us think of as Docker for Linux, or as Docker for Linux. Let's try this again. Docker for Linux is what most of us people think of when we think about Docker. Docker also has support for Windows and Windows containers. So author here decided to spin that bad boy up and start poking around and seeing what this thing can do. And as I talk through this, I'm reminded of our earlier conversation about, is it okay to go and scan a website? So we're coming back. I'm not aware of that. Let's leave it at that. But on his machine, he's running Docker, looking at the Docker service. He sees that, hey, there's a ton of named pipes being created. And this blog post sort of walks through as he does this and looks both between the Docker source code and sort of sees what's going on in there. Looks at these named pipes in the system. He actually wrote a little utility to list out those named pipes. He ends up finding an undocumented API. Keeps going and going, and next thing he knows, he's able to figure out a way to write through to his host file system on Docker for Windows, which means at that point, if you're able to, if you're writing, you're probably going to be writing with an administrative user. He manages to figure out how to actually modify their files that then be executed, and he's able to basically create like malware, right? But what's interesting, at least what really caught my attention about this, is the thought that they gave at the end, because usually what he was saying is for him, the first way that he'd figure out how to do this, for that program to be executed, you have to reboot the machine, like a startup program, right? And if we're trying to weaponize something to get someone to execute it, at least in modern day, Windows is finally sort of stable. We still joke about rebooting. It's not something you want to do all the time. And if your machine just reboots by itself, it could be like, what just happened? So he talks through about, how do I trigger this exploit without restarting the machine, which I thought was sort of interesting. But, for folks who aren't familiar with Docker on Windows, maybe go grab a Windows container and play with that. Or take a look through how these guys looked at, using these named pipes. And this has been around for, 2-3 years, I believe. So I'm surprised someone didn't come up with this earlier, but pretty good read.
Pretty good read, and what happened or what just happened might be a good candidate for your T-shirt list there, John. We have to resurrect that this year. With that, I think we're out of time. So we do need to say thank you to John. Thank you to Akira. Thank you to all of our listeners. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of Valentine's Day, and if you were watching, and if you're a fan of Michael Keaton as Batman, Susie and the Banshees are touring again. So check out Face to Face from the movie Batman Returns, and as well, of course, Kiss Them For Me. Great songs, as well as great deep list of albums from them all. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.